Today on M3, we're going to talk about the Qabalah, so I'm going to have to brush up on my knowledge a little bit. Now, I've got a ton of books that I'm going to flip through, and oh no, I sense an incoming montage. Must resist the urge to. Wait, what am I doing? I'll just call someone. Operator, connect me to Jack Chanek. Welcome to Music, Myth, and Magic. I'm Eric Arcadian, and today I'm speaking to Jack Chanek. Now, Jack is a Gardnerian high priest. He's the author of Qabalah for Wiccans, Tarot for Real Life, and Queen of All Witcheries, and he's also a tarot reader. Jack, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and to just kind of kick off some questions here, can you tell me a little bit about how you got started on your path?
Yeah, this is a story that kind of changes every time I tell it. Not because I'm deliberately fiddling with it, but just because I think these autobiographical stories, there are so many different factors that come together to put us on the path that we end up on. And every time I look back, there are different details that jump out and seem relevant. I was raised in an aggressively non-religious household. My father was raised Catholic and he was angry about that until the day he died. My mother was, sort of passively an atheist, didn't have strong feelings one way or the other. But I kind of grew up in a household where religion, let alone magic, religion was for stupid people. Religion was a way of controlling the masses, and there was no point in being religious if you weren't either a mindless sheep or someone who was trying to, profit off of the mindless sheep. And around the time that I left for college, I started to realize that that just wasn't where I stood. I think ultimately you can put people under a microscope, and there are two kinds of people in the world. There are the people who get something out of religion, and there are the people who don't. And much to my chagrin, I started to discover that I was the former. I needed myth and ritual and symbolism. I'm a very intellectual person. I live up in my head most of the time. And I really needed that kind of embodied, ecstatic experience of religious ritual that pulls you out of your head and gives you this transcendent connection to something other than your own thoughts. And I, started to mess around with things. I'd been reading tarot since I was a kid. I started reading tarot when I was 11. And my parents both sort of thought it was a stupid passing fad of an interest. They didn't really expect it to go anywhere. But I picked it up as a kid and stuck with it and had been reading tarot ever since. But when I was a freshman in college, I was living alone in a studio apartment in the south of France. And I started trying to figure things out with ritual. And, I was a broke college student. I didn't have access to a lot. There wasn't a pagan community in the south of France. I didn't have access to a lot of books. So most of what I was learning from as I was trying to sort of figure this thing out and find something that felt right for me was old occult sources that are in the public domain and that were available for free online. So I read a lot of Golden Dawn era Kabbalistic stuff. And especially because I had been reading tarot for so many years, that was a really natural entry point for me into magic, and then from magic into paganism. Uh, I was reading Mathers and Crowley and Eliphas Levi, and these were the kind of big figures who really shaped a lot of my understanding of what magic was and what magic could be and what ritual could be. And for a while, I was clinging to this idea of being an atheist. So for a while, I really just did my own thing and tried to sort of pull myself up by my bootstraps and have something resembling a religious practice that scratched that itch that I didn't have to call religion. So I did a lot of ritual involving the spirits of tarot cards, actually. I worked very closely with the spirits of the 22 major arcana in a magical and ritual setting. And that was fabulous work. But a lot of why I was doing that work was because it kind of felt like religion, but no one treated those entities as gods. So I didn't have to admit that I was being religious. And eventually I moved to New York. And when I did, I decided to rip off the Band-Aid. And I sought out a Gardnerian coven and was with them up until I moved out of the area. So that's kind of the story, the roundabout story of how I ended up where I am now.
Okay, so I have to ask, if you were in sort of like a anti-religious household for so long as a kid, how did you actually come across tarot for the first time?
James Bond. There is a James Bond movie from the 1970s called Live and Let Die. And in that, the leading lady is played by Jane Seymour, and she's a tarot reader named Solitaire. And she initially is on the side of the villain, and she uses tarot reading to, outwit and outmatch Bond. And then eventually he seduces her using a stacked deck of tarot cards, which is highly unethical for anyone listening. But, when I was a kid, I watched this movie and I just thought, wow, she's so interesting. She's so cool. She's mystical and magical. And I want to do what she does. So I convinced my parents, who were big James Bond fans, to get me a tarot deck for my 11th birthday. And I started reading tarot because of James Bond.
What a fantastic explanation. I love that. That is perfect. That's better than anything I could have imagined. So when you started reading some occult books, you started with some really heavy stuff.
I did. Yeah, I dived right into the deep end. No, again, it was because that was what was available to me. I didn't have a bookstore that was selling pagan books nearby. I didn't have any people that I could talk to in real life. And what I had access to were these old occult texts that someone had decided to digitize and stick online for free. And so that was my starting point.
At what point did you seriously start studying the Qabbalah?
That was pretty early on. That was kind of the first thing that I did. So the first memory I have of saying, okay, I'm gonna do occultism was reading Samuel MacGregor Mather's translation of the Sefer Yetzirah on the Internet Sacred Texts Archive, because it was an entry point through tarot, right? I was already reading tarot. I'd been reading tarot for a very long time. And I knew that there had been this group called the Golden Dawn. I knew that they had been really influential in the structure of tarot and the way that modern tarot is practiced. And I knew that it all sort of had something to do with Qabalah. And so when I decided to start exploring magic seriously, I was probably 17 years old at this point. And I wanted to attack Qabalah because that was relevant to what I already did. I felt like that was kind of connected to tarot in a way that I could handle. And it was a bumpy road, because the Sefer Yetzirah is a dense text, which also I know now, I didn't understand at the time, really can't be properly understood if you take it out of the context of Judaism. And Mather's translation treats it as a piece of European occultism and completely ignores the existence of the Jewish religion, which sort of saps a lot of the life out of that particular text. But, I would read it for a while and I'd go, this is all nonsense. And I'd kind of grumble and walk away. And then a month later, I would come back to it and be like, well, maybe there's something here. Let's give it another shot. And I just did that over and over and over again. And eventually, it came to a point where I started to see what the underlying structure was and how things were meant to fit together. One of my complaints about Golden Dawn Kabbalistic correspondences in tarot, or about, I think, occultism more generally, had always been that the correspondences that people used felt really arbitrary. And it was only once I started to see the underlying structure and the rationale behind why they were what they were that I could get on board with using them and applying them in my ritual and then my magic.
I can't really even imagine approaching learning the Kabbalah as like just reading a translation of the Sefer Yetzirah as my first introduction to it, because I had your book, I had Duquette, I had a lot of other resources, and then I moved to some of those more heavier tomes and just complicated, far out type stuff like that. So were there any other tools that you used to kind of help you interpret or sift through?
Honestly, no. Like, I also read the Mather's translation of the Qabalah Unveiled, but I think that's not the answer you're looking for. No, I didn't read a lot of the friendlier texts until I'd been doing it for a couple of years. I started out with Mathers, and then from Mathers I went on to Dion Fortune, and then from Dion Fortune I went on to Aleister Crowley, and those were the texts that I cut my teeth on. And then I started reading, Duquette or Gareth Knight, or William Gray, and I was like, oh, this can be easy? Why didn't anyone tell me that? And it really was. It was a breath of fresh air coming out of those really, really hard texts. But it was also, I think, really good for me to have started right at the source, even though that's not the easiest or best way to learn this stuff. But for me, I think it was really helpful, again, to go back and just see what the underlying rationale was behind all of it. Because a lot of the time with friendlier texts, because they're trying to present information in an approachable and understandable way, they'll give you the what and they'll sometimes leave out the why. They'll say, the card of Cancer the card of the Chariot in the tarot deck corresponds to Cancer in astrology. And they won't really explain why that correspondence is there or how it's supposed to work, because they're just trying to give you the first pass of information to familiarize you with it. And I've always been the sort of person who refuses to accept any information unless you explain to me how it's supposed to work. So I think it was actually very good for me to start with those really dense texts, because that is all in there. If you read the Sefer Yetzirah, you can eventually, after a lot of suffering, piece together exactly why Cancer and the Chariot are supposed to go together. And having that structure was really beneficial to me.
Well, that's really hardcore. Props to you for starting out that way. Now, I'm going to ask you a question that you probably hear a lot, and I hear a lot of people ask this question too. Why should you learn the Kabbalah?
I don't think that anyone has to learn the Kabbalah, but I think that anyone involved in magic who takes the time to learn it will find that their magical practice and that their engagement with the wider magical community is enriched for having done so. Qabalah is one of the languages of the occult, and especially of occultism in the post-Victorian Western world. It was so important, not just to the Golden Dawn, which is kind of the keystone of modern occultism, but it was so important to all of 19th century European occultism. And then even going back further than the 19th century, you see it really as early as the 17th century in European magical treatises. And that is something that it's beneficial to understand, even if it doesn't become a deep part of your own practice. It's beneficial to be able to read Cornelius Agrippa and see where he's bringing Qabalah into the mix and see where his rationale is Kabbalistic. Qabalah is one of those systems of occultism that are so influential and so pervasive that even if it's not in the heart of what you're doing, it's going to be in the heart of what someone else is doing and you're interacting with them. And being able to understand where they're coming from will make their magic more accessible to you, and it will also just give you skills to navigate the magical world. A thing that I say, I think in the introduction to Qabalah for Wiccans, is that it's very difficult to put the Kabbalistic genie back in the bottle. Once you learn how to see the world through a Kabbalistic lens, it's impossible to turn that off. And anytime you interact with anything, there will be a little voice in the back of your mind saying, well, because of such and such thing, you could really understand this as corresponding to the path between Gevura and Tiferet. And what does that mean? And it gives you this robust way of approaching any kind of magic. And, as with any other tool, you don't have to use Qabalah for everything. Qabalah is a tool in your magical toolbox, and some tools are more suited to certain tasks than others. You don't use a chainsaw to hammer in a nail. But it's a good tool to have. And there will be times where you find that it's the right tool to use. Just like the 4 elements or the 7 planets or any other framework that people apply in occultism.
It's another way to do woo-woo.
It's another way to do woo-woo.
I think I'm a lot like how you said that someone can tell you the correspondence, but you want to know why. And I feel that, there's a lot of things in ritual that we do or that I've read about in other rituals that say like, use this color, use this number of things, use this planet, blah, 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 so on, so on, so on. And I always think, why? Why do we do that? And when I study Qabalah, it turns out that almost everything that I come across is based on some sort of Kabbalistic correspondence. Like, if not now, then from, a ritual 50 years ago that it was based off of or something like that. So it really unlocked all of this understanding for me of where things came from. Not only just applications that I can use today in my magic, but understanding how people practiced and where they were getting their information from before. But on the flip side, Jack, I'm wondering, is there any reason that someone should not practice or learn Qabalah? And there is some talk sometimes in some circles about there being some cultural appropriation.
Yeah, it's a thorny topic. Qabalah originates in the Jewish mystical tradition. Qabalah originates in medieval Iberia, and it's a form of Jewish mysticism designed to connect the Jewish people with their God. So the word Qabalah, actually, if we were pronouncing it the correct Hebrew way, it would be Qabalah, is derived from a Hebrew root meaning to receive. And the Qabalah is a body of received wisdom that helps access a mystical dimension to Judaism. And what happens pretty much as soon as Qabalah emerges in the medieval Jewish community is that you get Christian mystics who go, ooh, that's fun, I want that, and who sort of snatch it up and start using it for their own. And you get the emergence of a Christian Qabalah, which intentionally removes all of the elements that sort of look specifically Jewish and tries to reimagine Qabalah as something that connects Christians with their God. And this was, you know, the context of medieval Europe, not terribly culturally friendly to the Jewish people. This was part of a much larger project of cultural ostracization and eradication. And it was an attempt to dilute and diminish Jewish culture and forcibly integrate it into Christianity. And that sucks. That's a bad legacy and a thing that we need to sort of be aware of and be conscious about engaging with. And then after Christian Kabbalah becomes a thing, it gradually works its way into Western esotericism more generally, and it becomes sort of divorced from the specifically Christian religious elements, and then people start applying it just as a system of magic. So this is something that you see, I already mentioned Cornelius Agrippa, Francis Barrett, but then later on, you get it sort of culminating in the esoteric secret societies of the mid to late 19th centuries. And yeah, there is an element of cultural appropriation there, and that's undeniable. Qabalah, the Jewish Qabalah, is still around. It's still a living mystical tradition in Judaism today. And it's radically different from the kind of thing that Golden Dawn ceremonial magicians are doing. And it's, you know, there are just these two different things that happen to go by the same name. But if you trace it back far enough, these two things have their origin in this violent appropriation of Jewish mysticism by the dominant Christian culture. And it's a tough question, right? How to deal with a legacy of cultural oppression, of anti-Semitism that is folded up with not just sort of the appropriation of certain kinds of ideas or theological principles, but is also folded up with anti-Semitic violence and, you know, the terrible, terrible legacy of anti-Semitism and of the marginalization, oppression, and genocide of the Jewish people. How do you engage with that if you're not Jewish? And to be honest, I don't have the right answer. I think the closest I come to the right answer is that it's a thing that anyone trying to engage with Kabbalah needs to be aware of and thoughtful about. I have Jewish friends who feel very strongly that Kabbalah is Jewish and should remain Jewish, and that it's inappropriate for non-Jews to practice Kabbalah. I also have Jewish friends who feel very strongly that it's not. And, you know, it doesn't turn into a he said, she said. It doesn't turn into a, like, well, you just pick a token Jew who has the opinion that you want to have, and then you get a get out of jail free card. Like, that's not how that works, right? But I think that the best anyone can do, if you're not Jewish and if you're thinking about engaging with Kabbalah, is to talk sincerely to the Jewish people who are in your life, and try to get a sense of how they feel, and kind of proceed or not proceed according to your best judgment from there. My own feeling on the matter is that Kabbalah had become such a major component of Western esotericism that pretending it's not there would be foolhardy. I think for myself, and this, you know, other people have different approaches, and that's totally legitimate. But for myself, I really feel that this is not something that we can make go away just by deciding not to do Qabalistic magic, because that legacy of oppression still is there and still has worked its way into, in many ways, into the fabric of a lot of Western occultism. And the thing to do about it is not to bury your head in the sand and go, la, 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 I can't hear you. There's no such thing as Kabbalah. That never happened. I am of the opinion that the thing to do is to stop and really just sit with that legacy. And, you know, it's tough. There were members of the Golden Dawn who were casually anti-Semitic in the way that white imperialists at the end of the 19th century and start of the 20th were, there were also prominent members of the Golden Dawn who were Jewish, right? Mona Mathers came from a Jewish family. She was Jewish. And she consulted with Samuel, her husband, on the translation of these Jewish texts. It's not black and white. It's messy. And I think the best thing we can do is just let it be messy and make the best good faith effort we can to engage with it in whatever the most respectful way is.
Hey guys, it's me, Eric, obnoxiously interrupting you halfway through the interview. If you're enjoying it so far, please consider checking out my Patreon page and becoming a supporter. It would really help me out. Plus, sometimes there are secret surprises. Check out any of the links below for more information. And without further ado, let's get back to the interview.
I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's what I've got.
No, that's totally a satisfying answer. And for the most part, I would say I agree with you. An awareness of where it came from is definitely something that we want to have and that we want other people to have also. We don't want to bury our heads in the sand and try to ignore it or ignore where it came from. And we should respect where it came from. I feel like it is so interwoven with what we do today that there really wouldn't be any possible way to remove it, even if all of us collectively decided, let's get rid of it. Let's do our own thing now because we've all been thinking this way for so long. But I had Deb Lip on the show a few episodes ago. And one of the things that she told me that really stuck out was that, if you're going to go really heavily into it, then maybe just consider doing something positive for the Jewish community, like maybe make a donation to a synagogue or something like that. I mean, that's the opinion of one person. That's her opinion. I think it's a great idea. And just in general, a way that might help make a positive impact somewhere. But as far as the Kabbalah goes and the Tree of Life, we've been talking about it for quite a while on this episode. And for anybody who doesn't know exactly what that is, I mean, if you were going to give them like a 5-minute TED talk on the Tree of Life, how would you explain it to them?
So the Tree of Life is a symbol, and it's kind of the central symbol of magical Kabbalah. And the Tree of Life is a diagram that maps out the magical universe into a set of different kinds of magical energy. And this diagram is understood to be several things at once. It is a map of different magical dimensions and different planes, if you want to do astral travel or anything like that. It is a myth about the creation of the world. And so it's this very Neoplatonic image of the divine emanating from sort of the ultimate one Godhead through various different kinds of godly energy until it becomes the manifest world that we inhabit. The Tree of Life is also a map of different parts of the human soul, and it gives expression to the different forces that are active within our own psyches. So the Tree of Life is lots of different things at once, but basically what it is it's a way of organizing magical information. So you have 10 spheres on the Tree of Life, each of which represents a particular kind of magical energy. So you have the ultimate divine oneness at the top of the tree in the sphere called Keter. Down at the bottom of the tree, you have manifest physical reality in the sphere called Malchut. And then in between them, you have spheres that represent things like, severity and harshness and roughness or discipline. But then on the other end of things, you have kindness and compassion and mercy. You have a sphere that represents beauty. You have a sphere that represents the intellect. And these spheres categorize different kinds of magical energy, different kinds of psychological experiences that we have, different forces that are at work in the world. And the Tree of Life gives you a way of mapping those magical energies and the relationships between them. And it also serves as a sort of card catalog for the universe, for the magical universe. So every sphere on the Tree of Life corresponds to a whole bunch of different things. Um, there are, colors and herbs and numbers and animals and gemstones and deities that all correspond to a particular sphere on the Tree of Life. And no matter what concept you're interacting with, no matter what you're doing magically, there is a way to interpret it through the lens of the Tree of Life as corresponding to some part of the tree. And in that way, the Tree of Life gives you kind of this wealth of information and this ability to connect everything to everything else, which is the heart of magic, right? Magic relies on the idea that everything is connected to everything else. And the Tree of Life gives us a way of doing that. It says, okay, you are doing a ritual for the Egyptian goddess Hathor. Hathor, because of these connections that she has, is understood to correspond to the sphere of Netzach on the Tree of Life. So if you want to enrich your ritual to Hathor, use all of this information that we have about the magic of Netzach. Use this incense, use this color, repeat actions this number of times. And in doing so, you can deepen whatever magical action you're doing, and you can deepen it specifically for the purpose that you're trying to achieve. So the Tree of Life is a way of organizing magical information so that it's readily accessible, and you can draw on it for whatever magical work you want to do.
So Jack, when we recommend Qabala books within our coven or to students, we usually talk about three. So there's the mystical Qabalah, the Unfortunate. There's the Chicken Qabalah by Duquette, and then we also recommend your book. So I have spent quite a bit of time like reading all three of these books, and they all have a different feel. And when I read yours, it's almost as if you talk about the spheres as if they are like people, friends, like they have a personality. I'm just wondering, like, how did you get that relationship with them?
That is a fabulous question. I think that for me, magic has always had to be experiential. Again, I'm a very intellectual person. You hear this when I talk, I can't shut up. But the reason I started doing magic was because I needed the experience of it. I needed that embodied oomph. And so everything I engage with magically comes back to that experience. It comes back to a way of, having a conversation almost with whatever magical thing I'm trying to interact with. Again, I started magic by interacting with the major arcana of the tarot as spirits, as people, as separate entities from myself. That was my first instinct when I started doing magic. And I've just kind of brought that attitude over into everything else that I do. So I hadn't really thought about this distinction between the way that I talk about the spheres and what you see in Duquette or Fortune, but you're right. I do talk about the spheres in many ways as personalities. And it's because to me they are. It's because the way that I came to understand whatever the sphere of Yesod was that I would set up a ritual and I would sit and I would do a meditation and I would effectively have a conversation with Yesod. There's more to it. I would do a journey of astral travel and I'd go to an astral temple and I would be in a room that was all purple and surrounded by crescent moons and whatever, because that's the kind of visualization that we're taught to do in a lot of Kabbalistic magic. But it was about getting to know this magical energy almost as a person. I think that's a really beautiful way of explaining the approach that I have to it. Yeah.
Oh, it definitely helped me connect to some different aspects of the tree by feeling that type of energy, that type of personality energy. Now, if someone was going to try to get started maybe with like some Qabala magic, what kind of tips might you have for them?
Qabalistic magic is so much easier than everyone is afraid it's going to be. I think Kabbalah has a reputation for being so intricately ceremonial and for requiring so many different tools that are prepared at a certain time, and they have to be made out of silk that was spun by a virgin, and they have to be red if you're doing this ritual, but you can never use the red robe if you're not doing that ritual. You have to use a different robe. And I think people get overwhelmed before they even try because they have this impression that Kabbalistic magic has to be complicated. It doesn't. It does not have to be complicated. The point of Qabala is to give you a wealth of information that you can apply in magic as you see fit. And you can do as much of that or as little of that as you want. Just bringing in a color correspondence is a way of doing Kabbalistic magic. A very low effort way, but it's a way of bringing Qabala into your magical system. So, as an example, if I'm doing a love spell, a lot of the time people use red and pink, and those are kinds of the default colors that people use for love spells. I pretty consistently use green if I'm doing color work in love magic, because green is the color of the sphere of Netzach, and Netzach is the sphere of love. And that's just the Kabbalistic connection that is there for me. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to do this big, grandiose, extravagant whatever. I'm more or less going to do the same kind of simple candle spell that I was going to do anyway. It just happens that one of the elements, one of the layers of symbolism I'm bringing into that spell is Kabbalistic in nature, because I'm choosing the color green purposefully as a way of connecting that back to the Tree of Life. So I think fundamentally what Kabbalistic magic is about is identifying the kind of magic that you're trying to do, the magical energy that you're trying to work with, the goal that you're trying to achieve, and then thinking about how that relates to the Tree of Life, finding it on the Tree of Life, and then choosing as many or as few symbols from the Tree of Life as you want to hammer that connection home. So if you want to, you can use the color green and light 7 candles and do it on a Friday at sunrise and invoke the goddess Hathor, and also, burn, oh gosh, what would that be? Sandalwood. And you can do all of those things if you want to do them, and you can make it as complicated as you want, but it doesn't have to be. You can make it as simple as you want as well. And the point of all of the correspondences in Qabala is to make magic easier for you and not to put a burden on you where you have to do a whole bunch of extra stuff.
Okay, so not to make it too complicated, but what if I'm one of those people who wants to know why things are the way they are? And what if I want to know why is green the color associated with Netzach? Where do I go if I want to learn something like that?
Well, you read the Sefer Yetzirah, obviously. It's a good question. Not to toot my own horn here, but I really tried to push that to the fore in Qabalah for Wiccans. One of the reasons that I wrote Qabalah for Wiccans was that I was frustrated with beginner Qabalah books that didn't give the why. And so with the color correspondences as a perfect example, I have a whole section where I talk through, here's the color theory that was being kind of developed in Victorian society around the time that the Golden Dawn was doing their magic. And here's why they brought these colors in and applied them in the way that they did. And here's why Netzach is green. Netzach is green because it combines the energies of Chesed and Tiferet, and Chesed is blue and Tiferet is yellow, and blue plus yellow is green. And then, of course, there's the question of why is Chesed blue? But I try really hard to explain a lot of the whys in my book, so that I'm showing you the structure underneath everything, and not just telling you Netzach is green, but giving you a way of seeing the rationale, because that was always the thing that I wanted when I was studying Qabala. Honestly, I do think that I do it better than anyone else does. I know that's a terribly arrogant thing to say, but I do think that my book is a good starting point, at least, for understanding the why. And once you have a foot in that door, then it's easier to go and read other books, including the Sefer Yetzirah, if that's what you want to do, and start to piece together how the system is supposed to work. I don't know. Like, I just used your question as an excuse to plug my book, but it's a good book. That's why I wrote it.
It's okay. Plug it. It's a great book. If anybody is out there, I'm going to have links to all this and more in the video description. So if you are wondering, why is it such a great book? Go click the link, grab a sample, read it a little bit, and you will see why it's such a highly recommended resource in our coven, at least. So you read tarot, you work with the Qabbalah. How does tarot connect with the Qabbalah?
It's all Qabbalah. It's Qabbalah all the way down. Most of the structure of the tarot deck as we understand it today is Kabbalistic. There weren't set divinatory meanings for the cards prior to the 19th century. Well, in the 18th century, you start to see people applying tarot in divination. So there's a text by Antoine Couchébelin, where he argues that the tarot is actually a secret ancient book of Egyptian wisdom that was brought to Europe by the Romani people. That's all historically false, but that's kind of the starting point of the idea that tarot has mystical associations to it and should be used for divination. But he doesn't hammer down what the cards mean or how we're supposed to interpret them. And then as we work our way into the 19th century, we start to see people applying Qabbalah to the tarot deck, partly because there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and there are 22 major arcana. There are 10 spheres on the Tree of Life. There are 10 numbered cards in each of the 4 suits. These things fit together in a way that looked very natural and very easy. And people tried a number of different ways of connecting tarot to Qabbalah. Lots of people agreed that tarot and Qabbalah should go together, but there was no real standard way of doing that until the Golden Dawn took over. And the Golden Dawn developed a system of Kabbalistic magic and used tarot really as the linchpin in their whole magical system. Tarot was the thing that held together all of the Kabbalistic magic of the Golden Dawn. And so they developed a system wherein the 4 of Wands had a defined and specific meaning, because the 4 of Wands was a card associated with the sphere of Chesed. It was associated with the elemental world of Atzilut. It was associated with a particular planet. It was associated with a particular part of the zodiac. And through these correspondences that the Golden Dawn imparted to the 4 of Wands, because that held together that was the way of them organizing the rest of their magic. The 4 of Wands took on a very specific divinatory meaning, whereas previously it had just kind of been a card in the deck that everyone agreed probably had some divinatory significance, but there was no accepted standard way of interpreting it. So if you pick up any deck that is based on either the Rider-Waite-Smith or the Thoth tarot decks sort of structures, if you pick up any deck today that's based on one of those two, and the overwhelming majority of decks are, you're going to be using a set of readings, you're going to be using a set of symbols that go back to the Golden Dawn and their system of Kabbalistic magic. If you look at the 10 of Pentacles, for example, in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the arrangement of the 10 Pentacles on the card is the Tree of Life. That's that Kabbalistic image. It's right there in the heart of Rider-Waite-Smith style tarot. And then because the rest of tarot owes such a massive debt to the Rider-Waite-Smith, sort of indirectly, the rest of tarot ends up being deeply Kabbalistic, even when the deck creators don't have any Qabbalah in mind. Because Qabbalah is just so deep in the bones of what tarot is.
Yeah, wow. That is an excellent explanation. So historical. I love all the ways that you back up everything you're saying with random bits of historical information that you're keeping on catalog in your brain. It's fantastic. So, um, I know we have spent pretty much almost this whole time talking about Qabalah for Wiccans, but you have two other books, and I want to hear about those books too. So tell me about the two other books that you've written.
Yeah, so my other two books are called Tarot for Real Life and Queen of All Witcheries, respectively. Tarot for Real Life is, unsurprisingly, a tarot book. And this book is, I had a conversation with my editor when I was pitching this book. And I said, the thing that really frustrates me about most tarot books is that they lean so heavily on the major arcana. You'll have a tarot book and 2/3 of it will be about the major arcana. And then the minor arcana are kind of treated as an afterthought. But first off, the minor arcana make up most of the deck, right? There are 56 out of 78 cards. And then secondly, the minor arcana really and truly are the themes that actually matter to most of us. Like the major arcana are the big archetypal things about fate and justice and death, and yeah, that's great. That has a place in the mythic narratives that we construct for ourselves. It's very important. But most of the time, if you're doing a tarot reading for someone, it's because they want to know if they're going to get the job, or if the person they went on a date with is going to call them back. And those aren't major arcana questions. The minor arcana are the cards in the deck that deal with everyday themes, that deal with the kinds of things we encounter in our day-to-day lives. Money, work, health, sex, love, family, communication, whatever. Like, those are all minor arcana themes. And so I wanted to design a tarot book that taught tarot in a way that foregrounded those practical, real-world themes, and that taught how to read tarot for actual everyday questions. So that book, I'm so proud of that book. I love that book so much. It is structured the way that the tarot deck is structured. So you start with the practical stuff, and I talk about how to choose a tarot deck, what matters when you're choosing a tarot deck. I talk about kind of just the hands-on of like how to begin reading tarot and getting in the habit of doing a daily draw or something like that, practicing. And then I talk about the suit of pentacles, because that's the practical part of the tarot deck. And then after that, I talk about the intellectual stuff. I talk about using tarot spreads, and I talk about using reversals and these sort of more analytical techniques for reading tarot. And I fold that in with a discussion of the suit of swords, because that's the intellectual stuff. And then I talk about the intuitive stuff with the cups, and then I talk about the sort of ethics and the aspirational stuff with the wands, and I talk about the people with the court cards, and only at the very end of the book, once you understand all of that, do we start talking about the big picture stuff with the major arcana. Because to my mind, you can only really understand the major arcana once you have the minors. So I wanted to teach tarot in a way that really highlighted the importance of the suits, because I think most tarot books neglect that, and I think it's a real shame. So that's the tarot book. The other book, Queen of All Witcheries, is a book about the goddess. The goddess being the goddess who is worshipped in Wicca, including in Gardnerian Wicca, but also more broadly, if you go to a women's spirituality event, if you go to an open pagan circle, or any of the varieties of religious and spiritual experience that have emerged in the 20th and 21st centuries that are goddess-centric. A lot of the times people will talk about the goddess. And usually they're talking about a very particular figure. She is a goddess of motherhood, usually. She is understood to be sort of the great mother, the mother of us all. She is a goddess of the moon and the earth and the tides. She's understood to rule over sort of the cyclical aspect of nature. So, she doesn't move in a straight line. She moves in a spiral or a cycle. She's a goddess of love and of artistic inspiration. She's a goddess of witchcraft and of magic. And as I describe her, that's a very particular deity. That's not, you can't plug in the Morrigan and say that the Morrigan is exactly the same as that goddess, because the Morrigan is totally different. There's something completely different going on. So when people talk about the goddess, they're usually identifying a really specific figure. And the fascinating thing about this goddess is that she's not ancient. We don't find her anywhere in ancient mythology. The closest we get is maybe the goddess Isis, who has a lot in common with the goddess worshipped in the modern world. But we don't find this deity anywhere in the ancient world. And that's fascinating to me, because I worship her, right? She's real as far as I'm concerned. She's there. But if she wasn't worshipped in the ancient world, or at least if she wasn't worshipped in the way that we understand her now, where did she come from? And so Queen of All Witcheries explores who the goddess is, what we mean when we say the goddess, but it also explores how this goddess came to be known in the modern world. So it's looking at the magical practitioners and the religious leaders and the anthropologists and scholars who had ideas that shaped the way that we think about the goddess today. So it starts in like the mid 1800s, and it talks about the invention of this anthropological idea of an ancient goddess worshipping matriarchy, which we now know is historically unfounded. That's not what the ancient world was like. But it was this very sexy idea that came out in the mid 19th century. And it took the world by storm. And all of a sudden, there was this idea that the ancient world had focused on the goddess. There had been a goddess who was the mother goddess, the leader of the matriarchy. And where do we go from there? And then I talk about a lot of the other sort of ideas and magical practices and sort of religious movements that take inspiration from that and build on it and grow from it. And all of these things come together in this beautiful, amazing, magical way to allow for something like the goddess religion that we have today to exist in the world. So, you and I have talked, when we were talking about Qabalah, we've talked a lot about the way that I like to go back in history and look at where things come from. Because I think that what we do now is always enriched by understanding where it came from. And so Queen of All Witcheries is about the goddess in that way. The subtitle of the book is A Biography of the Goddess. And the point is, like, we're worshiping this goddess. Let's get to know her a little better. And let's understand not just who she is, but how we came to know her in the way that we do. And who were the people involved in the development of modern goddess religion.
So I was listening to you talk about Queen of All Witcheries, I think on Seeking Witchcraft, the podcast. And I found it really interesting because and forgive me if I'm misquoting you, but I believe what you were talking about was how the maiden mother crone archetype is really a modern construct. And when I heard you say that, I just thought, because I am the type of person that likes to know where things came from, but there are some things that I don't even think to ask, where did this come from? So I am glad that you have brought this up and started this line of thinking, because I haven't read it yet, but it is on my reading list. I do look forward to reading it, but I think that's such an interesting discussion. I think there's probably a lot of things in our craft and in our practice that we just kind of accept for what it is without understanding why or where it came from. So I think that's a really healthy discussion.
I think people are sometimes afraid to look at history, because I think people sometimes have this worry that if what I'm doing isn't ancient, then it's not legitimate. And my crusade is to get rid of that idea in paganism and in witchcraft. So much of what we do comes from a particular moment in time, comes from particular people, and is not ancient. And that's okay. That's not just okay, that's cool. It's exciting. And it doesn't make anything that we do less real or less legitimate or less magical. It just means that we have a better understanding of what it is and why we're doing that. And I think that's so exciting.
100% agree with you. Um, I know we're kind of getting close to the end of our time here, but before I ask you the very exciting signature question, Jack, I would love for you to share where people can find you, if you'll be at any events coming up. If somebody's trying to learn more about you, where should they go?
Yeah, I used to have more of an online presence than I do now. I just got sick of a lot of social media. I do still have a YouTube channel where I post things pretty frequently. You can just find me by searching my name. I think I'm the only person on the planet named Jack Chanek. I also have a blog that I run, which is Jack of Wands, Wands, like the suit in the tarot. Jack of Wands Tarot.wordpress.com. And I'm sort of half-heartedly on Instagram. So you can find me on Instagram at Jack underscore of underscore wands. That's kind of it as far as online presence right now. I just got really, really sick of social media. I think it's so poisonous. I don't currently have any like events or public appearances scheduled, but I will probably be doing that again at some point. I just moved to Salt Lake City fairly recently. So if you're in Salt Lake City, come find me, say hi, shoot me an email, or leave a comment on my YouTube or something. But otherwise, I will probably be kind of exploring events around this area at some point soon. But I moved here from the East Coast, so I haven't really put down roots yet. But that's where you can find me on the internet.
Excellent. So if anybody's looking for more information, I will have all of those links posted in the video description below. And speaking of your move, right? Congrats. And you did just kind of open the doors to like a teaching coven or a teaching grove there, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any seekers yet. You run a coven, so you know how this goes. The listing is up, the door is open, and now it's just a matter of waiting and seeing if anyone is interested in walking through it. So theoretically, I'm open and will be, taking on seekers at some point. It's unfortunate because ideally a Gardnerian coven should be run by the partnership of a high priestess and a high priest. I am the only Gardnerian in the state of Utah. There is no high priestess around, so I have to bootstrap, which is not ideal, but we're doing the best that we can. But yeah, if anyone watching this, if you are in Utah and you are interested in Gardnerian Wicca, feel free to reach out. And eventually people will find me. That's how it works.
You've got the astral door open, and that's what's important. And wow, what a claim to make. The only guard in Utah is crazy.
It helps my ego for sure.
All right, it's time for the signature question, Jack. How do you use sound or music in your personal magical practice?
I came into magic vibrating names a lot because that's a Golden Dawn magical technique. So finding that sort of deep, resonant voice and then vibrating names of power became a really important part of my magical practice very early on and continues to be so. More recently, in recent years, I have explored a lot with the magical use of song in ritual. This is something I don't do as much in a coven setting. We might all chant together, but we won't necessarily use song proper. But I do a lot of a cappella singing when I'm doing magical work just on my own. And I will find a song. Sometimes it's like, a pagan chant, and sometimes it's a Death Cab for Cutie song. But I will find a song that lyrically encompasses what I'm trying to do. And I will use that as kind of the focus of my magic. And I'll just allow my voice and allow the sort of a cappella singing to be the thing that drives the power in my magic. So I don't do that in groups. Like I said, I prefer to keep my singing to myself, but it works for me.
Well, that's beautiful. When you were saying that, it made me think that fairly recently I've also discovered that a song can make a nice offering or, you know, like gift for ancestral work, at least to my ancestors. They dig it. Now, when you do something like that and you are choosing a song on your own for your ritual work to sing, is that planned out or is that more like in the moment, whatever feels right?
Usually it's planned out. There have been times where I was in a ritual, had not planned to sing, and am sort of halfway through a spell and realized that I needed something more, and it felt right in the moment to start singing. So there have been times that that's happened. But usually, if I'm using a song in Magic, I go into it knowing that and with the intention of incorporating that.
Beautiful. Well, Jack, we've hit the end of our time, so I will go ahead and end our call here. But I just want to say thank you so much again for taking the time to be on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation. I had a great time.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Wow, what a great interview. Another big M3 thank you to Jack Chanek for taking the time to be with me on the show today and for answering all of my Qabalah questions. Now, if you haven't already checked out Queen of All Witcheries, Tarot for Real Life, or Qabalah for Wiccans, go ahead and click one of the links in the video description below and get yourself a copy. Please remember to like and subscribe here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Eric Arcadian. If you're tired of waiting for these interviews to come out, you can get a hold of them before everyone else if you check out my Patreon page, where early access is a subscriber benefit along with tons of other cool stuff. Plus, it really helps me out with making more content in the future. Remember, there's always a way to make music. Until next time.